As we've been pursuing our extreme makeover, Romans edition, we have been talking here in the last couple weeks about justification and what that means to a Christian. Paul has introduced to us Abraham, who was the model of justification by faith, being credited righteousness, not as an act of something that he had done, but as an act of faith in God's grace. The Tin Man, I think, is a very nice guy, but he did not have a heart. And so he went to go see the Wizard of Oz. And when he talks to the wizard, he says, I need a heart. And the wizard can't give him a heart, but what he can, he says, back where I come from, there are men who do nothing all day but good deeds. They are called good deed doers. Yeah, that's the word. And their hearts are no bigger than yours, but they have got one thing that you haven't got. Well, I think as we look at the verses here in the second section in the book of Romans, we have to ask, what do Christians have that other people do not have? And what Christians have that other people do not have, the first thing that Paul tells us is that we have justification. We have been made righteous. We have been declared righteous. We aren't perfect. We aren't moral. Some of us aren't even very good. But we have been declared righteous by God's grace. He has credited the righteousness that is Jesus Christ to our account, just filling up our bank account, our morality bank account, our righteousness bank account with His righteousness, so that we have been declared righteous, so that we can come into His presence and have a relationship with Him. Then He starts working on us to try and change us. That's what happened with the Tin Man. You know, what did he didn't have something. What we don't have is righteousness of our own, and God gives us that righteousness. Now, Paul, here in chapter 4, he's moving from talking about the vertical relationship that we have with God and what justification means there. It means, and its meaning for our faith with God, to a horizontal significance. It's meaning with our relationship to other Jews, to Jews, and to Christians around the world. How do we relate to them? Especially, how do we relate to the Jewish people? Because they had the law, they had the prophets, they had the sacrifices, they had all of these things. Are we in the same boat with them, or do they have special privileges? Do they have to have faith like we do, or do we have to have faith like they do? And so he introduces Abraham again to us. He talks about our forefather, and there he's talking about all the Jewish people, saying he belonged to us. But in talking about Abraham, those are kids. I'll mention them in a minute. He talks about Abraham being our forefather in according to the flesh. Now, this is My Three Sons, an old TV show that none of you even watch on, TV Land. This is My Three Sons. And these three kids are his son, Fred McMurray's sons, not by virtue of the flesh, but by virtue of some sort of fiat from the casting studio. You know, they had just said, these are going to be your kids. Well, Abraham was the father of all the Jews. They were Jews. They were children of Abraham by flesh. But how are we children of Abraham? And Paul is going to unpack that question. He's going to make clear why that clarification was needed. Why did he have to say children according to the flesh? And he unpacks that here in this paragraph today. From the standpoint of the flesh, this is the standpoint of faith, Abraham is far more than just the ancestor of the Jews. He is the ancestor of everyone who accepts God's righteousness by faith. He is our ancestor by faith because we get righteousness the same way that Abraham did. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. We believe God, and it is credited to us as righteousness. So he is our father as well. God's people are determined not by biology, but by spirit. by following after Abraham in believing God and allowing God to credit our account with righteousness. You know, we don't look like Abraham. We may not be his biological children, but we are his spiritual children. And then Paul says that we are blessed. And the blessedness that he mentions here in verse 9 refers to the blessing that David talked about in the previous 2 verses, where he said that people are blessed whose sin the Lord will never count against them. That is everyone who believes. Everyone believes will never have sin counted against them. It's just impossible because God has declared us righteous. And that makes us blessed. And that blessing starts to change us in our lives. That blessing is acceptance before God. You are accepted and can be accepted just the way you are, without having to change. I'm ministering to a young man right now who believes that he has to be absolutely perfect and have every part of his life absolutely perfect. And he is wandering away from the idea that he is accepted by God. He thinks he has to do so much to help God or to be approved by God, but you don't. Now, God wants you to become a better person than you are right now, all of us. But he accepts us and loves us and cares for us. And that is a blessing. Now, Paul's going to ask, is this blessing only available to the Jews? Or can Gentiles participate in that? And in case you're wondering, you're probably all Gentiles out there. I don't know that any of us are Jewish folks by birth. I don't know all of you all that well, but, is it available to every one of us? Or is it just the Jews? And before answering that question, Paul is going to remind us of the key text that he has been focusing in on. And that text comes from Genesis chapter 15, where he says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He says, we have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness all along. Paul's answer is that Genesis chapter 15 comes before Genesis chapter 17. Now, I think that even accords with the math that I learned in school. You've got chapter 15, okay, that comes along. And then there's chapter 16, I'm pretty sure. And then chapter 17 is then next in line, right? Although you kids who know math? Spencer, is that right? 15, 16, 17? You don't know? Can you report him? Even in music we count, although up to 4. That's about as high as I can count. Paul's answer is that 15 comes before 17. Abraham believed God, and then later on in his life, it says he practiced righteousness. Now, I'm sure that Abraham became a much better man, sort of soon afterwards. But Paul's point is that he did not have to believe God. He didn't have to change his life in order to have righteousness credited to him. He believed God, and then later on practiced righteousness. In fact, later on was 29 years later, according to Jewish reckoning. They believed that Abraham wasn't circumcised until 29 years after he had faith. So Abraham was credited to have righteousness 29 years before he received the seal, the sign of circumcision, which was the sign of being a Jew. That was his act of obedience, 29 years after he chose to have faith. But chronology isn't the conclusive point. Paul goes on in 4:11 to talk about the true significance of this. And he says, alluding to Genesis chapter 17, he calls circumcision a sign, a seal, a way of telling that Abraham had faith. It was separated by 29 years from his act of faith, his beginning to have faith, but it was the seal of that faith. The ceremony simply put a seal on what was already true. And so it came years later. But it showed that this was true in his life, that he had faith. In verses 11b, that's the second half of verse 11, and 12, Paul draws out this significance of what he talks about in the beginning of verse 11. He said, Abraham is the father of all who believe but have not been circumcised. So if you're not a Jew, Abraham is still your father if you have faith, if you trust in him. And you don't even have to have very much faith. Jesus talks about having the faith of a mustard seed. The mustard seed was a